The recycled air in the torpedo room tasted like copper and wet dog. I pressed my spine against the freezing, sweating bulkhead, my heart hammering against my ribs so hard I thought it would crack them. Outside the heavy steel hatch, the sound was rhythmic. Schlock, schlock, schlock. The sound of bare, water-bloated feet dragging across the diamond plate decking. Then came the scratching fingernails, or what remained of them, screeching against the pressure-treated paint. It wasn't just one of them anymore. I could hear the wet, rattling breath of at least 3. We were 4,000 feet below the Atlantic, encased in a steel coffin called the USS Blackfin, and the dead were knocking. 5 hours ago, we were a crew of 120. Now, I didn't know if there were 5 of us left. It started in the medical bay. Chief Miller had come back from that rescue mission on the surface with a bite mark he claimed was from a shark. He was sweating, his eyes turning a milky, bruised purple. By the time the captain realized what was happening, Miller had already torn out the throat of the corpsman. The transition didn't take hours like in the movies. It took minutes. One moment, you're screaming for help. The next, you're a mindless, snapping machine of bone and gristle. I watched through the reinforced glass of the mess hall as my best friend, Davies, was pinned to the deck. He didn't just die. He changed while they were still eating him. His eyes rolled back, the pupils shrinking to pinpricks, and he began to twitch with a violent, unnatural electricity. He stood up with half his face missing and immediately lunged for the man next to him. The claustrophobia of a submarine is something you can never describe to a surface dweller. There is no away. There is only the next compartment, the next hatch, the next narrowing of the hallway. The lights had flickered and died an hour ago, replaced by the haunting, rhythmic pulse of the red emergency strobes. Each flash revealed a new nightmare, a blood-streaked wall, a severed hand gripping a railing, a shadow that moved too fast. I gripped my only weapon, a heavy, grease-stained pipe wrench, until my knuckles went numb. My breath was coming in short, jagged gasps. I had to get to the bridge. If I could seal the central nerve center, I might be able to vent the atmosphere in the lower decks. Or maybe I just wanted to see the sonar one last time, to see the empty green screen and pretend the world above wasn't a graveyard of burning cities and floating corpses. The scratching outside stopped. A heavy silence settled over the torpedo room, broken only by the distant groaning creak of the hull under the immense pressure of the abyss. Then, a voice. "Help! Please, let me in." It was Miller, but his voice was wrong. It was too high-pitched, vibrating with a wet, gurgling hunger. I didn't answer. I knew Miller was gone. I knew that thing was just using the muscle memory of a dead throat to lure me out. I closed my eyes, the cold seawater leaking from a pinhole pipe, dripping onto my forehead like an icy finger. I wasn't going to die here. Not like this. I grabbed the hatch lever, my palms slick with sweat, and prayed to a God I hadn't spoken to in years that the hallway was empty. I threw the lever. The hiss of equalizing pressure sounded like a dying gasp. I stepped out into the crimson dark, the smell of rot hitting me like a physical blow. The floor was slick. My boots slid on something soft, and I nearly fell. I looked down. It was a uniform, shredded and soaked in dark, viscous fluid. As I looked up, the red strobe flashed. For a fraction of a second, the hallway was illuminated. 10 feet away, a figure stood. It was hunched over, its arms unnaturally long, its skin the color of a drowned fish. It turned its head, the neck cracking audibly in the silence. Its jaw was unhinged, hanging by a single tendon, and its eyes, those milky purple voids, locked onto mine. It didn't scream, it just started to run. The sound of its feet on the metal was a frantic, wet slapping. I swung the wrench with everything I had, the metal connecting with its temple with a sickening crunch. It didn't fall. It didn't even flinch. It just kept coming, its teeth snapping inches from my throat. I kicked it back, the force of the blow sending it tumbling into the shadows, and I bolted. My lungs burned. Every corner I turned was a gamble. I passed the galley where the smell of old grease was buried under the stench of a slaughterhouse. I could hear them in there, dozens of them, the sounds of wet tearing and low animalistic growls. I reached the ladder well leading to the command deck, my hands shaking so badly I could barely grip the rungs. Above me, I heard a metallic clang. Someone was coming down. I looked up, the red light pulsing. It was the captain. His gold dolphins glinted in the strobe, but his throat was a jagged red crater. He looked down at me, a string of black bile dripping from his chin, and let out a sound that wasn't human. A high-frequency shriek that echoed through the hull, signaling every monster on the ship that dinner was served. I scrambled back, my heart seizing. There was nowhere left to climb. I had to find a way to the auxiliary ballast controls. If I couldn't save the ship, I would sink it into the trench. I would let the ocean crush us all before I let these things reach the surface. The pressure was building in my ears, the weight of the water above us pressing down like the hand of a vengeful ghost. I ran through the engine room, the heat from the nuclear reactor making the sweat sting my eyes. The shadows here were long and jagged, dancing with every flicker of the dying lights. I saw a movement in the corner of my eye, a shadow detaching itself from the machinery. Then another. They were surrounding me. The wet slapping of their feet was coming from all sides now. I backed into a corner, the wrench held high, my breath hitching in my throat. This was it, the end of the line. 4,000 feet down, in the dark, where no one would ever hear my screams. The first one stepped into the light, its face a mask of torn flesh and mindless hunger. I gripped the wrench, my vision blurring. "Come on then," I whispered, my voice cracking. "Let's see who breaks first." The first one to reach me was Miller, the chief engineer, or what was left of him. His coveralls were soaked in hydraulic fluid and dark, sluggish blood that didn't seem to flow so much as ooze. He didn't scream. These things didn't have the breath for it. Their lungs filled with the same viscous fluid that was replacing their lifeblood. He just lunged, a silent, predatory weight. I swung the wrench with every ounce of terror-fueled adrenaline in my marrow. The heavy iron tool connected with the side of his head, a sound like a dry branch snapping, and he collapsed into the churning gears of the secondary turbine. There was a sickening crunch, a spray of black grit, and the machinery groaned, the rhythm of the ship faltering for a heartbeat before grinding his remains into the works. I didn't have time to vomit. The second one, a junior technician I'd played cards with just 3 days ago, was already on me. His fingers were cold like slabs of refrigerated meat as they clawed at my throat. I shoved my forearm against his windpipe, the heat from the reactor shielding behind me, searing through my flight suit. We tumbled back against the control panel, my hand frantically searching for a grip, a weapon, anything. My fingers closed around a heavy brass fire extinguisher. I slammed it into his chest once, twice, until the ribs gave way with a wet pop, and I could scramble back. I stood there, chest heaving, the air in the engine room growing thick with the smell of ozone, burnt rubber, and the copper tang of blood. The lights flickered again, plunging the room into a strobe-like nightmare. With every flash, the shadows moved closer. There were 5 of them now, circling the catwalks, their eyes reflecting the dim red emergency glow like the eyes of deep-sea fish. I knew I couldn't fight them all. Not here. I backed toward the manual override for the ballast vents. If I could just get the sea to take us, the pressure would do what my hands couldn't. I reached for the lever, my gloves slick with grease. The metal was ice cold. I pulled, straining against the mechanical lock. A groan vibrated through the hull, a deep tectonic shriek that made the very floor plates under my feet shudder. The sub tilted, the nose dipping toward the dark maw of the trench. Outside, the pressure was already over 2,000 pounds per square inch. At this depth, the hull was a fragile bubble, a thin skin of steel holding back an entire ocean's worth of hatred. I felt the descent in my gut, that weightless drop that tells you you're no longer in control. One of the creatures leapt from a higher gantry, its body hitting the floor with a thud that should have broken its legs. But it just scrambled up, its joints clicking in ways they weren't meant to. I grabbed a flare from the emergency kit on the bulkhead and struck it. The brilliant, blinding magnesium light hissed to life, casting long, frantic shadows. The things recoiled, their milky eyes squinting, their pale skin smoking under the heat of the chemical burn. It gave me a second, just a second. I bolted for the ladder, my boots clanging on the rungs as I ascended toward the middeck. Behind me, I could hear them. They were climbing too. They weren't fast, but they were relentless, a slow-motion tide of death rising from the bowels of the boat. I reached the hatch and slammed it shut, spinning the wheel until my muscles screamed. I leaned my forehead against the cold steel, listening to the frantic scratching on the other side. It sounded like rats, hundreds of rats trying to gnaw their way through. I took a shaking breath, trying to steady my vision. The corridor ahead was a graveyard. The emergency lighting was more consistent here, a sickly yellow that didn't hide the carnage. Bodies, some whole, some not, littered the narrow walkway. The smell was the worst part. It wasn't just the smell of a morgue. It was the smell of something stagnant, something that had been dead for a long time, but was still moving. I had to get to the bridge. I had to see the depth gauge. I had to know how much time was left before the ocean finished what the virus started. I moved quietly, my back against the bulkhead, the wrench held ready. Every creak of the hull sounded like a gunshot. The pressure was so intense now that the rivets were starting to weep, tiny jets of seawater misting into the air like diamonds in the dim light. I passed the mess hall, the door hanging off its hinges. Inside, I saw movement. I didn't look. I couldn't look. If I saw their faces, I'd lose what was left of my mind. I thought about my wife, Sarah. She was probably up there, somewhere on the surface, maybe looking out at the Atlantic and wondering when the sub would breach. She didn't know the world had ended. Or maybe she did. Maybe the surface was just as bad, a landscape of fire and teeth. The thought was a lead weight in my chest. If everyone was gone, what was I even fighting for? Why not just open the inner hatch and let the Atlantic end it in a millisecond? The vengeful ghost of the ocean would be a mercy compared to this. But then I heard it, a sound that shouldn't have been there, a rhythmic tapping. 3 short, 3 long, 3 short. SOS. It was coming from the radio shack. My heart hammered against my ribs. Someone was alive. I wasn't the last soul on this steel coffin. I turned away from the bridge and headed toward the communications room, my feet splashing through the shallowing water that was beginning to pool on the deck. The tapping was louder now, frantic. I reached the door and whispered, "Who's there?" The tapping stopped. A voice, thin and cracked with terror, came through the metal. Is someone there? Please, they're outside. I can hear them breathing." It was Thompson, the junior communications officer. He couldn't have been more than 20. "It's me," I said, my voice barely a rasp. "I'm opening the door. Be ready." I turned the handle and pushed. Thompson was huddled in the corner, a flare gun clutched in his trembling hands. The room was a mess of shattered glass and torn wires. He looked at me, his eyes wide and bloodshot, and for a second I thought he was going to shoot. Then he slumped, the flare gun hitting the floor. "The surface," he choked out. "I got a signal before the mast snapped. It's everywhere. It's not just the ship. London, New York, Tokyo, they're all gone. They're calling it a total extinction event." I sat down on the deck, the weight of his words more crushing than the 4,000 feet of water above us. So, this was it. We were the last survivors of a dead world trapped in a sinking cylinder at the bottom of the sea. I looked at the depth gauge on the wall. 4,800 feet. The hull was rated for 5,000. We were nearing the crush depth. "We have to go," I said, though I didn't know where. "The engine room is gone." I opened the vents. "We're sinking into the trench." Thompson laughed, a dry, hacking sound that bordered on hysteria. "Where are we going to go, Captain?" "To the moon. There's nowhere left." "I'm not the captain," I reminded him. "The captain is one of them now, and we're going to the escape trunk. There's a DSRV attached to the aft. If we can get it launched, we might have a few days. Maybe we can find a remote island, somewhere the virus didn't reach." It was a lie, and we both knew it, but it was a lie we needed to keep moving. I helped him up, and we stepped back out into the corridor. The scratching at the engine room hatch had stopped, which was worse. It meant they'd found another way around. We moved toward the aft, our shadows dancing on the weeping walls. The sub gave a massive lurch, and the sound of screaming metal filled the air. A long, agonizing shriek as the pressure began to deform the outer hull. The floor tilted sharply, sending us sliding toward the bulkhead. "The trench," Thompson screamed. "We're hitting the slope." We scrambled to our feet, the water now at our knees. It was freezing, the temperature of the deep ocean beginning to bleed through the failing insulation. We reached the galley, and there they were, a dozen of them, blocked by a fallen storage rack. They turned as one, their pale, bloated faces illuminated by our single flashlight. They didn't make a sound, just started climbing over the debris with a terrifying, singular purpose. I fired the flare gun I'd taken from Thompson. The ball of white fire hit the lead creature in the throat, exploding in a shower of sparks. It didn't stop them. It just lit up the nightmare as they swarmed over the table, over the ruins of our last meal. "Run!" I yelled, shoving Thompson toward the ladder to the aft deck. We climbed, the water chasing us up the rungs. The pressure was building in my head now, my ears popping painfully as the internal atmosphere began to compress. We reached the escape trunk, the small, circular chamber that was our only hope. I shoved Thompson inside and was about to follow when a hand grabbed my ankle. It was cold, the grip like an iron vice. I looked down. It was the captain. Half his face was gone, his jaw hanging at an impossible angle, but his eyes, they were focused. There was a spark of something there, a glimmer of the man he used to be, twisted by whatever malice drove this infection. He pulled, his strength amplified by the mindless hunger. I kicked at him, my boot connecting with his chest, but he didn't let go. He was pulling me back into the dark, into the rising water. "Close the hatch," I shouted to Thompson. "No," the kid cried, reaching out for me. "Close it. If they get in there, it's over. Go." I managed to wedge my wrench into the doorframe, using it as a lever to pry the captain's fingers off my leg. With a desperate heave, I kicked him square in the face, feeling the bone give way. He fell back into the waist-deep water, disappearing into the shadows. I scrambled into the trunk, Thompson pulling me in with a strength I didn't know he had. We slammed the hatch and spun the wheel just as the first of the things reached the glass port. Its face smashed against the thick acrylic, leaving a smear of black gore. We were in the small, cramped sphere of the deep submergence rescue vehicle. It was tiny, barely enough room for the two of us to sit, surrounded by a confusing array of switches and monitors. I hit the release sequence. The mechanical arms that held the DSRV to the submarine's hull groaned. For a long, terrifying minute, nothing happened. The sub was still sinking, dragging us with it into the abyss. Then, with a violent jolt that threw us against the padded walls, the locks disengaged. We were free. I looked through the small, thick viewport. The submarine, the USS Vindicator, was a ghost in the dark. As we drifted away, the external lights of the DSRV caught the hull. It was buckling, the massive steel plates folding inward like a tin can under a boot. And there, pressed against the windows of the sinking ship, were the crew, dozens of them, their pale faces illuminated by the dying glow of the reactor. They weren't fighting anymore. They were just watching us. The sub slipped away, a dark shape falling into the infinite black of the trench. We were alone. The DSRV's motors hummed, a tiny, fragile sound in the vast silence of the deep. I looked at the sonar. We were at 5,200 feet and rising slowly. Thompson was shaking, his hands buried in his face. "What now?" he whispered. I looked at the surface monitor. It showed nothing but the dark underside of the waves, a vast, undulating ceiling that separated us from the ruins of our world. I thought about the pressure, the weight of all that water, and the horrors that were waiting for us at the top. I thought about the captain's eyes and the way the hull had folded. "Now," I said, my voice steady for the first time in hours, we wait. We wait for the sun to come up, and then we see what's left of the world." But as I spoke, I noticed something on the sonar, a cluster of small, fast-moving objects rising from the trench below us. They weren't fish. They were moving with a direct, calculated path. They were following us. The virus hadn't just taken the crew. It had taken the ship, and now it was taking the ocean itself. The wet, slapping sound I'd heard in the engine room. It wasn't just feet on metal. It was the sound of something adapting to the dark. I gripped the controls, the cold seeping into my bones. We weren't escaping. We were just leading them to the surface. I looked at the self-destruct toggle on the console, a small red switch protected by a plastic cover. The weight of the world felt heavy then, heavier than the ocean. I reached out, my finger hovering over the glass. I survived the submarine. I survived the dark. But as the shadows below grew closer, I realized that survival was just another word for a longer, slower death. "Thompson," I said, my voice barely a whisper, "look at the sonar." He looked. His face went pale, the last of the hope draining from his eyes. He didn't say anything. He just reached out and placed his hand over mine, his fingers trembling. We sat there in the silence of the deep, two ghosts in a glass bubble, watching the dots on the screen climb higher and higher. The ocean was no longer a grave. It was an incubator, and we were the bridge to the world above. I took a deep breath, the air in the pod tasting of recycled oxygen and fear. "Let's see who breaks first," I muttered, mirroring the words I'd said in the engine room. But this time, I knew the answer. The world was already broken. We were just the last shards waiting to be ground into the sand. I flipped the cover on the switch. Outside, the black water pressed in, ancient and uncaring, as we rose toward a dawn that might never come. The first of the objects hit the bottom of our hull with a dull metallic thud. Then another, and another. They were here. I looked at Thompson, and in his eyes, I saw the reflection of the end. I didn't wait for them to break the glass. I didn't wait to see their faces again. I just closed my eyes and pulled the lever, letting the ocean finally have its way. The last thing I felt was the sudden, overwhelming warmth of the sun, even though I knew it was just the fire of our own end, blooming like a red flower in the cold, dark heart of the Atlantic. The roar wasn't just a sound. It was a physical weight, a hammer blow of pure kinetic energy that stripped the breath from my lungs and turned my vision into a fractured kaleidoscope of orange and white. The lever hadn't just released the emergency scuttling charges, it had triggered the pressurized ejection of the escape sphere, a violent birth from the dying womb of the USS Vanguard. For a second, there was no up, no down, only the sensation of being a pebble in a Titan sling. The heat I'd felt, that red flower of the end, wasn't just the explosion of the reactor. It was the friction of the sphere tearing through the lightless columns of the Atlantic. I felt my teeth rattle against my jaw, a metallic tang of blood filling my mouth as the G-force pinned me against the padded seat. Beside me, Thompson was a statue of terror, his hands locked onto the armrests so hard his knuckles looked like polished bone. The thudding against the hull didn't stop. Even as we ascended, something was out there, caught in the slipstream of our rising coffin. It wasn't just debris. Through the small, reinforced porthole, I saw a shape, pale, bloated, and terrifyingly fast, tethered to the pod by a snagged piece of external railing. It was one of them. The objects weren't just sinking corpses. They were the mutated remnants of the crew that had been outside when the airlocks failed. Their lungs filled with brine, but their neural pathway still firing with that singular, necrotic hunger. The pressure difference should have crushed it, turned it into a red mist, but the virus had done something to the cellular density. It clung there, its face pressed against the glass, eyes milk white and staring, its jaw unhinged and snapping at the reinforced acrylic. The sound of its teeth scraping against the window was a high-pitched scream that bypassed my ears and went straight into my marrow. The sphere groaned, the interior lights flickering from a harsh emergency red to a dying amber. We were rising too fast. The nitrogen in my blood felt like it was starting to boil, a slow, prickly heat that signaled the onset of the bends. But I couldn't slow us down. If we slowed down, the ocean would simply reclaim us. I looked at Thompson. He wasn't looking at the monster on the glass. He was looking at me, and his expression wasn't one of fear anymore. It was something colder, something calculated. He reached into his flight suit, his movements jagged and frantic. I thought he was reaching for a sedative or an oxygen mask, but when his hand came out, it held the heavy, blackened steel of a flare gun he'd lifted from the engine room locker. My heart, already hammering against my ribs like a trapped bird, skipped a beat. "Thompson, What are you doing?" I choked out, the words tasting like copper and recycled air. He didn't answer. His eyes were darting toward the small, locked briefcase tethered to my wrist, the hard drive containing the genetic sequencing data from the sub's lab, the only thing that explained why the virus thrived in the deep-sea trenches. "It's not for you," he whispered, his voice a dry rasp. "They promised a seat. One seat. They said the pod could only sustain the oxygen mixture for one person if the surface was contaminated. They didn't tell me you'd be in it." The betrayal hit harder than the explosion. We had bled together in the dark, fought through the flooded corridors of the Vanguard, and watched our friends get torn apart by things that shouldn't exist. And here, in the final ascent, the math of survival had turned him into a stranger. "There is no they, Thompson," I said, trying to keep my voice steady as the pod tilted violently. The creature outside smashed its fist against the glass, a spiderweb of cracks blooming where its knuckles hit. "The world is gone. There's no one waiting for us but the dead." He shook his head, a manic glint in his eyes. "You don't know. The signals, I heard them on the long-range comms when you were fixing the ballast. A rig. Deepwater Horizon 2. They've got a perimeter. They've got a cure. But they only want the data. And they don't want witnesses." He leveled the flare gun at my chest. The pod gave a sickening lurch as we hit a thermal layer, the external temperature spiking. The creature on the glass screamed, a sound that shouldn't have been possible underwater, as the pressure change began to liquefy its outer layers. But it didn't let go. It was a hitchhiker from hell, determined to see the sun. "Drop the drive," Thompson commanded. I looked at the glass, then back at him. The cracks were spreading. The unbreakable acrylic was failing under the dual assault of the creature and the rapid decompression. "If you fire that in here, the oxygen-rich environment will turn this pod into a furnace," I warned, my hands slowly creeping toward the manual release of my harness. "We both die." Thompson laughed, a sound that was more of a sob. "I'm already dead. We all died the second that sub hit the bottom. I just want to see the sky one last time without you breathing my air." He pulled the trigger. The world turned into a roar of magnesium light. I dived sideways, the harness tearing at my shoulder as the flare hissed past my ear and slammed into the rear bulkhead. The interior of the pod ignited instantly, the localized fire devouring the oxygen in a hungry gulp. I lunged at Thompson, my fingers clawing for his throat as the heat began to blister my skin. We grappled in the cramped, burning space, two drowning men fighting over a sinking ship. I could hear the exterior hull screaming now, the sound of the ocean trying to get in, and the creature outside was hammering with a rhythmic, mindless intensity. Through the haze of smoke and fire, I saw the depth gauge. 100 feet, 80, 60. The pressure was dropping so fast, my ears felt like they were being pierced by hot needles. Thompson's hands were around my throat, his face a mask of primal rage. He was stronger than me. Fueled by a delusional hope that there was a world left to save him, I felt my vision blurring, the black spots of hypoxia dancing at the edges of the fire. With a final desperate surge of strength, I reached for the manual override of the porthole's internal blast shield. If I couldn't stop him, I'd let the ocean do it. I slammed my palm against the release. The heavy steel plate slid back, and for a split second, I saw the surface, a shimmering, oil-slicked mirror above us. Then, the cracked glass finally gave way. It didn't shatter. It imploded. A jet of high-pressure seawater, sharp as a diamond-tipped saw sliced into the pod. It caught Thompson across the shoulder, the sheer force of the water jet amputating his arm in a spray of crimson before he could even scream. The pod flooded in a heartbeat. The fire was snuffed out in a hiss of steam, replaced by the bone-chilling cold of the Atlantic. I was pushed back against the seat, the water filling my mouth, my nose, my lungs. I felt the pod breach the surface, bobbing like a cork in a storm, but I was pinned by the rushing inflow. Through the hole in the window, I saw the creature, or what was left of it, dragged inside by the suction. Its gray, rubbery fingers clawed at my flight suit, its teeth snapping inches from my throat even as the salt water began to dissolve its necrotic flesh. I kicked out, my boots connecting with its chest, pushing the thing back into the churning vortex of the flooded pod. With a heave that felt like it would tear my muscles from the bone, I unlatched the top hatch. The pressure difference blew it open, and I was launched out of the pod by the remaining air pocket. I hit the surface of the ocean and gasped, a ragged, burning breath of air that tasted of salt, smoke, and something foul, the smell of a world on fire. I floated there, bobbing in the swells, my lungs screaming as I tried to purge the water and the smoke. Around me, the ocean wasn't the vast, empty blue I had remembered. It was a graveyard of giants. Thousands of bodies, kept afloat by the gases of decomposition and their own bloated, viral-ridden tissues, carpeted the waves as far as the eye could see. They weren't just floating. They were twitching, their limbs moving in a slow, rhythmic mockery of swimming. The dawn Thompson had hoped for was a sickly, jaundiced yellow, the sun obscured by a global shroud of ash and smoke. In the distance, I saw the oil rig he'd mentioned. It was a towering skeleton of steel, wreathed in black smoke, with flickering orange flames licking at its legs. There was no rescue there, only a pyre. It was sinking, the heavy steel settling into its final rest. Thompson's face appeared for a brief second at the hatch, his eyes wide, his mouth open in a silent plea, before the water claimed him. He went down into the dark, back to the silent world we had tried so hard to flee. I was alone. I reached for the waterproof case tethered to my wrist. The drive, the weight of it felt like a lead anchor. All that death, all that horror, for a collection of ones and zeros that led to a world that no longer existed. I looked at the carpet of the dead surrounding me. One of them, a few yards away, turned its head, its eyes, milky and dead, locked onto mine. It began to paddle toward me, a slow, splashing sound that was joined by another and another. The ocean wasn't a barrier to them. It was just another hunting ground. I felt a coldness in my chest that had nothing to do with the water. My shoulder, where Thompson had gripped me, was burning. I pulled back the tattered fabric of my suit and saw it, not a bite, but a deep, jagged scratch from his fingernails, white-rimmed and already weeping a dark grayish fluid. The betrayal wasn't just the flare gun or the pod. It was the fact that he'd been turning long before we hit the surface. The virus was in me now. I could feel it. A low-frequency hum in my nervous system, a hunger that was starting to drown out the fear. I looked at the drive one last time. I thought about they Thompson believed in, the ones who would kill for this data. If they were out there, they didn't deserve a cure. They didn't deserve to inherit what was left. With a flick of my wrist, I unlatched the strap and watched the hard drive sink, a small silver glint vanishing into the abyss. The first of the floating dead reached me. It didn't bite. It just drifted closer, its cold, wet hand brushing against mine as if welcoming me home. I didn't fight it. I laid back in the water, looking up at the ash-choked sky, and waited for the sun to disappear. The warmth I'd felt in the pod was gone, replaced by a crystalline, perfect cold. I wasn't a survivor anymore. I was just another shard of a broken world, finally coming to rest. As the darkness began to creep into the edges of my vision, I realized Thompson was right about one thing. The pod could only sustain one person, but the ocean had room for everyone. The last thing I heard wasn't the waves or the cries of the gulls. It was the sound of 1,000 dead hearts beating in unison, a slow, subterranean drumbeat that matched the pulsing in my own veins. I closed my eyes and let the Atlantic take me, not as a victim, but as a part of its new, silent kingdom. The dawn had come, but it didn't bring light. It brought the end of the world, and for the first time in months, I wasn't afraid. I was just tired, and the water was so deep. The cold was not a sharp thing anymore. It had become a dull, heavy weight that pressed against my ribs, urging the last of the air from my lungs in a slow, silver stream of bubbles. I watched them go, those tiny spheres of life, racing toward a surface that no longer mattered. Above me, the ash-choked sky was a bruised purple smear, a ceiling of soot and misery that I was finally moving away from. The Atlantic didn't just take me, it welcomed me with the indifference of a god. I felt my limbs grow heavy, the muscles turning to lead, the frantic twitching of my nerves finally succumbing to the crushing embrace of the deep. I remembered the submarine, the claustrophobic metal coffin where I'd spent the last of my human days, and it felt like a dream someone else had had. The screams of the crew, the wet, tearing sounds of the infected as they ripped through the bulkhead, the smell of recycled air and copper. It was all fading, replaced by the rhythmic, thrumming pulse of the water. It was the drumbeat I had heard before I went under, a sound I had thought was a hallucination brought on by oxygen deprivation and despair. But as the light of the dying sun vanished and the blue-black abyss rose up to meet me, I realized the sound was real. It was the sound of the world's new heartbeat. It wasn't just the movement of the tides or the grinding of tectonic plates. It was them, down here, in the crushing dark where the pressure should have pulverized bone and liquefied organs. They were waiting. I saw the first of them as I drifted past the 300-foot mark. A woman, her dress a tattered shroud of gray silk that danced in the current like the fins of a ghost fish. Her skin was the color of a fish's belly, a translucent, sickly white that shimmered in the faint bioluminescence of the deep-sea organisms. She wasn't swimming. She was suspended, her head lolling back, eyes wide and milky, staring at nothing. Her mouth was open, and from her throat came that low subsonic vibration. The thrum. It wasn't a breath, for there was no air to breathe. It was a resonance, a frequency of the virus that had found a way to bridge the gap between the terrestrial and the aquatic. As I sank further, I saw more of them. Hundreds, thousands. They were a forest of the damned, drifting in the currents of the mid-Atlantic ridge, caught in the thermal vents and the slow-moving eddies of the abyss. They were the passengers of the luxury liners that had been overrun in the first weeks, the sailors of the ships that had been scuttled to contain the spread, the refugees who had cast themselves into the waves rather than face the teeth of their loved ones. They hadn't died. Not really. The salt had preserved them, and the cold had slowed their decay to a crawl, and the virus, that relentless, adaptive spark, had evolved. It had turned them into something that belonged to the ocean. I felt a strange, detached curiosity as my back finally touched the silt of the ocean floor. The pressure was a physical presence now, a massive hand squeezing the breath out of me, but the pain had vanished, replaced by a buzzing numbness that started at my toes and worked its way up to my heart. I wasn't afraid. Fear is a luxury of the living, a biological response, meant to preserve a life that has somewhere to go. I had nowhere left to go. I was at the bottom of the world, a speck of dust in a cathedral of water. Around me, the silhouettes of the dead moved with a slow, agonizing grace. They drifted toward me, drawn by the last flickers of warmth emanating from my cooling body. They didn't move with the jagged, frenetic hunger of the ones on land. There was no lunging, no snarling. Here, everything was silent. Everything was measured. They moved like seaweed, swaying to the rhythm of the subterranean drumbeat. I saw a man in a naval uniform, his gold braid tarnished to a dull brown, his face a mask of eroded flesh and bone. He drifted over me, his fingers brushing against my cheek with the softness of a lover's touch. His touch was colder than the water, a chill that seeped into my marrow and stayed there. I thought of Thompson and the pod. I thought of the way he had looked at me when he realized there was only room for one. He had thought he was saving me, or perhaps he was just saving the idea of humanity, a final futile gesture in the face of an extinction event. He hadn't known that the surface was just another kind of grave. Up there, the world was burning, the air thick with the dust of fallen civilizations and the stench of rot. Down here, there was only the blue and the black and the endless, rhythmic thrum. I closed my eyes, but the darkness didn't change. It was the same darkness that had existed before the first spark of life crawled out of the primordial soup, and it was the same darkness that would remain long after the last star flickered out. I felt my heartbeat slowing, matching the cadence of the dead. Thump, thump, thump. It was the sound of a clock winding down. It was the sound of the ocean reclaiming its own. I realized then that the virus wasn't a curse or a plague. It was a reset. It was the Earth's way of silencing the noise of a species that had forgotten how to listen to the quiet. The water filled my ears, a muffled roar that eventually settled into a singular, high-pitched note. I could feel the microscopic life of the ocean beginning to explore the edges of my skin, the tiny scavengers, and the silent bacteria that would eventually turn my body into a reef of bone and salt. I welcomed them. I was no longer the survivor of the USS Vengeance, or whatever name they had painted on the hull of that metal tomb. I was no longer a husband, a son, or a soldier. I was a part of the sediment. I was a part of the tide. I looked up one last time, my vision blurring as the salt took my sight, and I saw a flash of light far, far above. Maybe it was a ship burning on the horizon. Maybe it was a satellite falling from an abandoned orbit, a piece of human junk returning to the Earth. Or maybe it was just a trick of the mind, a final firing of neurons in a brain that was shutting down for the last time. It didn't matter. The light was small and lonely, and the darkness was vast and crowded. The man in the naval uniform was still there, his milky eyes fixed on mine. I felt a sense of recognition, a kinship that transcended the horror of what we had become. We were the silent kingdom. We were the guardians of the deep. waiting for the world above to finish its tantrum so that we could inherit what remained. The pressure no longer felt like a weight. It felt like a support, a cradle that held me in place as the world turned on its axis. I felt my fingers twitch, a reflex of the nerves that the virus was already beginning to hijack. I wasn't dying. The warmth I had lost was being replaced by a different kind of energy, a cold, kinetic hum that vibrated through the water and into my spine. I was becoming part of the drumbeat. I was becoming the sound that would haunt the dreams of any survivor lucky or unlucky enough to stand on a shore and look out at the gray, churning wastes of the Atlantic. I remembered the smell of rain on hot asphalt. I remembered the taste of a peach in midsummer. I remembered the sound of laughter in a crowded room. These memories were like old photographs left out in the sun, fading until they were nothing but white squares of paper. They didn't belong to me anymore. They belonged to a world that had died in the time it took for a single hatch to fail. I let them go. I let the names of the people I had loved drift away like the bubbles of my last breath. There was no grief in the letting go, only a profound, hollow peace. The ocean was so deep, so incredibly deep, and I was finally at the bottom. There were no more monsters to outrun, no more doors to lock, no more dwindling supplies to ration. There was only the long, cold sleep and the company of a billion brothers and sisters, all of us swaying together in the dark. The thrumming grew louder, a wall of sound that vibrated through the very marrow of my bones. It was a song, I realized, a wordless, ancient song of the abyss. It spoke of the rise and fall of continents, of the birth of oceans, and the death of suns. It was a song that had been singing long before humans had the arrogance to think they owned the earth, and it would be singing long after our cities were nothing but mounds of rust and glass. I felt my mouth open, and for the first time in months, I didn't feel the need to scream. I didn't feel the need to beg for mercy or cry out for a God that wasn't listening. I just let the water in. It was cold, and it tasted of salt and ancient things, and it was the most honest thing I had felt in a lifetime. As the last of my consciousness flickered like a candle in a gale, I felt a strange, terrifying joy. I had survived the submarine. I had survived the end of the world, and now I was finally going to live in the new one. The darkness was complete now, a velvet curtain that had fallen on the final act of a long and bloody play. I couldn't feel my hands anymore. I couldn't feel the silt beneath me or the pressure of the miles of water above. I was just a point of awareness in a sea of echoes. The drumbeat was my heartbeat, and my heartbeat was the drumbeat. We were one. The silent kingdom was no longer a metaphor. It was my home. I drifted there, a shard of a broken world, settled at last in the quietest place in existence. The dawn would come again and again to the surface, bringing its ash and its fire and its frantic dying struggles. But it would never reach me here. I was beyond the reach of the sun. I was beyond the reach of the light. I was in the deep, and the deep was in me. And for the first time since the world broke, I wasn't just tired. I was still. I was perfectly, eternally still. The Atlantic had taken me, and in its cold, dark heart, I had finally found the only thing that mattered in the end. I had found the end of the story, and it was beautiful in its absolute, unyielding silence. The thousands of dead hearts beat in unison, a slow, subterranean rhythm that echoed through the trenches and the plains of the seafloor, a testament to the new era. We were the ocean now. We were the waves and the salt and the dark. And we were waiting. We had all the time in the world and all the room in the sea. The end of the world hadn't been a bang or a whimper. It had been a slow, sinking descent into the blue until the light went out and the water was the only thing left. I closed my eyes, not to sleep, but to begin. The silent kingdom had a new citizen, and the water was so deep.